So Manu from Madrid wrote to us. He's a listener to the podcast, Steve, and he says, "Hi, I'm Manu from Madrid. Told you." And his question is about, he says, "Have you already covered the issue of money creation via interest and profits? I'd like to know if, as Spanish physicist Antonio Torrijos said some time ago, compound interest should be abolished, and if it was, what would be the consequences and how would we arrive there?" So compound interest is this interesting thing, isn't it? Which is, I mean, it's the way the economy works. If you've got money, you can use that money to get more money. We all know that. So if you invest $100 and with compound interest in 10 years' time, you would have made $63 in interest in that time. But similarly, if you owed $100, you'd owe $163 at the end of that 10 years. So it's great for those people with money. For those people who don't have money, compound interest can work the other way. Either way, it's evil, Steve.
Well, the intriguing thing, I mean, this is a very common issue when people, amateurs, try to understand the monetary system. They'll argue that it's inevitably going to lead to a compound interest running away, as you mentioned. Because the bank lends you $100 and they charge you, what was the interest rate you said there a moment ago?
5%.
5% interest on $100, and after how many years you are 163?
Yeah, 10 years.
After
if I've got the maths right, yeah, I think so. Anyway,
you have the maths right. So if you have to pay 5% interest on $100 for 10 years, at the end of it you're $163. And people say, look, you've borrowed $100, you've got to pay $163. The bank didn't give you the $63, so the only way you can pay it is by going back to the bank and borrowing more money again. And this is a common fallacy. Now, that's not to say compound interest is not dangerous, but that particular argument is a fallacy. The last time I had to deal with somebody who believed they'd found the secret of the universe by that particular issue was a guy who called himself Starman on Twitter, which I think is fairly appropriate. He's somewhere in outer space.
Off with the stars, yeah.
Off with the stars, or the fairies. I do know the lights up there. You know the lights in the sky that we see. They're actually fairy lights. You know that?
Right.
I read it on the internet. It must be true.
Long had my suspicion. Have you been using AI again? Is that where you got that from?
No, I've only got 5 fingers, so I can't be using AI. I think I count. Yeah. Approximately 5 fingers I can count there. Yeah. Somewhere between 4 and 7. And so what they state is that if you borrow the money, then necessarily the debt compounds because you charge interest on the debt. Now, the mistake in that form of thinking is not realizing that two things happen. If you're sensible when you borrow that money, you use it to make more money yourself. You borrow the $100 because you're investing in some marvelous business. I don't know. Let's say Big Bob's Bagel Bin. I think that's a business. I know that's vacant. It's something that's mentioned in Mankiw's textbook. Big Bob's Bagel Bin. So you could have dastardly. I can't think of an alliteration for your own name, but. You start a business, you sell $200 worth of bagels per year, you've borrowed $100 to start the business, you pay workers $160 over that time, you've got to pay the bank, you've got 5% interest, so $5, and you hang on to $35 profit for yourself. So what people who get caught up in this danger of compound interest is they believe that they add together the flow you've got to pay, the interest payment on the debt, to the original principal, and just think that describes the actual trajectory through time. Now, if you are and that means you simply can never afford to pay back the 100 because it becomes 105, 111.
But so you're saying if you use that money wisely, then you could, for example, get compound interest the other way. If you borrow that money and then you use it to buy shares, and then you get the growth in those shares, so you get compound interest as a benefit. But that's only applying if you're using that money to invest. But if you're borrowing the money because you've got into hard times, like you can't afford to feed yourself or pay your rent or whatever,
then you're in trouble. Trouble, and that is the real danger that people have when they're going to do any form of debt. If they don't generate the income to service the debt out of the debt itself, then they will end up going bankrupt. Yeah. So that's the real issue.
Well, and that is my point. Either way, it's a bad thing. It's it makes the rich richer than they could be because for example, the alternative is, if you buy bonds, for example, it's just a flat amount, isn't it? So but if you had bought $100 of bonds and it paid for you 5%, it would pay you 5% every year for that 10 years. You wouldn't get a compounded growth on that. That is the alternative model.
Yeah, well, actually, there's another alternative, and this just occurred to me in discussing with someone what the rate of interest actually is and how it's set, because one of the reasons that we charge interest or we accept the charging of interest on a loan is that we mentally put this in the same position as individuals borrowing from another individual. Now, you know, I've lent money to people and I've charged no interest on it. Two big mistakes in my past, okay, which I wish I hadn't made. But normally, if we're lending to somebody who's at arm's length from you, so not a family member you think you're doing a favour, but someone you're actually giving a commercial loan to, then if you as an individual lend somebody $100, that means you've got $100 less to spend. Let's make it more realistic, say I lend $100,000, so it's something serious.
Yeah.
If you lend somebody $100,000, that means that you can't use that $100,000 yourself, whether that's for consumption or your own business. So you would obviously, to make it worth your while to do without that money in a arm's length transaction, you would charge interest. So, well, I'll give you the 100,000 so long as you pay me 5% per year on that 100,000, and then that 100,000 becomes a source of $5,000 per year income to you. So that's the way we think about loans in general. We bring it back to our own situation as if we'd made the loan ourselves. But that, if you apply that to banks, what that implies is that banks are lending out money they could otherwise use themselves, and therefore you justify the same rate of interest. But that's not the case at all. Banks don't have a stock of money that they lend out to you. They don't lend out the money that depositors put with them. They create the money.
Yeah.
So what you're
So
doing...
they can quite happily do both. They could be
Well,
lending
they
out
can
and borrowing.
happily. But the thing is, what's the cost to them of creating $100,000? Okay, it's not $100,000. Okay, the cost of creating the money is the cost of the banking license, the staff you hire to run the bank, the ATMs, I believe some banks have branches. I thought branches were related to trees. I didn't know it actually meant banks having branches.
If you look
apparently,
back into prehistoric times, absolutely, people used to go into bank
go into a
buildings.
bank and just have a discussion with I think they call them tellers. They must have told you something.
Yeah.
The people but anyway, this
They
this
told
whole,
you to get to the back of the queue.
That's the physical infrastructure to create money is the computing and personnel and buildings you need to register as a bank. Now,
they've also got the cost associated with if that money passes to another bank. Of course, it's not.
Yeah, but the thing is, the money that to actually be able to create money, you need to be a bank. To be a bank, you've got to have the capital investment involved in that, and the staff as well. But if you're a normal business, you'd be calculating your rate of return on that capital. Okay. Well, let's say the capital involved in establishing a bank that you're dealing with is $1 billion, which large amount of money, but the thing is, how much money can they create? It's far more than the value of the bank itself. Far more than the debt is the money that they create is far larger than the capital they need to be able to be a bank and create money in the first instance. So if you looked at the amount of capital involved in a bank and look at the total amount of investment in the bank on an annual basis, it's the renewal of the capital and the payment of wages and so on. So it's an expenditure per year. You might let's say you had $1 billion worth of investment there, then a good rate of return on that would be something like 20 or 30%. So that's a few $100 million. Okay. So if you then said, well, how many loans do you create out of that bank over an annual basis? They can be much, much larger than the value of the physical bank itself. So you get a rate of return on a bank on the amount of money you create. From a business, you get a return on the amount of money you've invested to be able to make the goods and services. So in that sense, if we set banks to the same standard that physical businesses are set to, that you expect them to make a rate of return on capital of 10 or 20% per annum, then that'd be 10 or 20% on the capital cost of establishing the bank, not 10 or 20% on the amount of money the bank creates. And even 5% interest on the amount of money that creates is going to be a far higher rate of return than a 10 or 20% rate of return on the capital that they had to invest to become a bank in the first instance. So if we really understood how banks create money, which is just double entry bookkeeping, they make an entry in somebody. Once they negotiate a loan contract with someone, let's say a loan for $1 million to buy a shoebox in Surrey Hills, then they'll put $1 million in your bank account, which you then transfer to the person you're buying the shoebox off, and they record $1 million of debt that you owe to them, and then they charge interest on that debt of 5% per annum. That's an enormous rate of return compared to the rate of return that ordinary businesses have. And the reason we allow them is we still think about banks as we think about individuals making a loan, that if an individual makes a loan out of their cash reserves, they can't spend that money. So you have to compensate them for the loss of their own income, of their own money, for their own potential income earning purposes. So that's why if I was making that loan again, then I would charge at least 5% interest to make up for the fact that I'm doing without the money I lent.
Right.
Banks don't do without the money. Okay, they're created.
Yeah,
so
so that's all new money going into the system in effect, or it can be, as we've talked about previously, it can be destroyed as well. But say it's all new money, but that's not compound interest unless you don't pay. I mean, if you pay off that debt at the agreed rate, then there's no compound interest component to that, is there? It's just a straight debt.
A lot of people take out a loan, let's stick with $100,000 figure. Take out a loan as working capital. So you take out the loan so that you can buy the equipment and maintain the equipment for a small business. So if your capital costs for the small business are $100,000 a year, let's say, then you've got to pay, and you borrow the money for it, then you've got to pay $5,000 per year to the bank. You need to make a $5,000 per year profit out of that business to be able to service that debt.
Yeah.
And most companies that get involved in loans like that, we're obviously not talking household loans here, they manage that fairly comfortably. So the interest doesn't get added to the principal. You pay the interest out of your profit. The debt remains at $100,000, and most companies will maintain that debt. They will just roll it over on a regular basis rather than paying it off.
Doesn't work that way with a mortgage, of course.
No, the mortgage you've got to pay off. Okay, so when you take on a mortgage, then you're committing yourself to pay 5% per annum and repay the principal as well over time. And the longer the time it takes for you to repay it, the more the payments are payments to the principal rather than the interest itself. But if you look at what banks do from the point of view of the cost of production of money, they're getting paid hand over fist compared to real businesses, because a real business might make 20 or 30% return on capital, and that's why I'm using. I've used the example of $100,000. That's not a lot of money, and I'm using facetious figures to some extent here. But if you borrowed $100,000 and made $20,000 or $30,000 per year gross profit, then you can easily service the $5,000, and that's the money you've taken out as a cost of capital for your own business. But banks, the rate of return on banks is far higher than the rate of return on ordinary businesses, because ordinary businesses have to sell goods and services using machinery that they've purchased to create those goods and services, and their rate of return is relative to the amount of capital that they've put into the business, not to the amount of with banks get the return based on the amount of money they've created, which is far more than the cost of capital of establishing the business in the first place.
So, looking at the other side of the equation, though, where money is being invested and you're getting the return, and that return then means you can invest more, so you get this compound growth. So if you've got a share portfolio, your share portfolio grows, you've therefore got more shares, therefore they grow more. This is what Antonio Turiel was, his argument about this compound interest is basically potential exponential growth as a result of this. which, he's called sort of like a quasi-religious aim, this belief that in capitalism, exponential growth is a good thing and it's sustainable and can go on forever. Wealth will keep on accumulating merely because you've got money, and that can't go on forever.
No,
I mean,
it can't. And that's the key point that I think Einstein described in compound interest as the eighth wonder of the world, because when you do the calculations, the rate of growth can be, get to the stage where if you got 1% interest on $1 at the time of Jesus Christ, then over 2,000 years you've got an enormous amount of money created that way. And if you look at history, you don't get those smooth periods of exponential growth. You get periods of growth and busts afterwards. And the thing which has fooled us into believing this can go on forever is that we've lived in the 250 years since we discovered we could use fossil fuels to power machinery and generate far more wealth, far more physical goods out of the use of fossil fuel power to drive these machines. And that's given us these effectively exponential growth in energy consumption and exponential growth in living standards for a quarter of a millennium, 250 years worth. But if you go back to 1750 and go right back to previous historical times as well, there was no such trend in the energy consumption that we were doing. We could use the energy of slaves, energy of serfs, energy of animals, a small amount of wind power, and with old-fashioned Dutch windmills and things of that nature. But generally speaking, we were restricted to the energy that we could get out of the natural environment, out of ourselves as animals, if we had slaves or serfs, or other animals that the slaves or serfs would then tend, and that was the limit. And so, over about an 800, there's a great Bank of England database where they try to work out what was the standard of living for the average working person right back to about 1000 AD, and they found that from 1000 AD to about 1750. There were ups and downs at various times, but basically there was no change in the living standards in terms of the goods consumed by an average working person in the British Isles. So in previous times, rather than believing it was natural to charge interest on a loan, it was regarded as unnatural to charge interest on a loan, and that was the crime of usury. And you can find this, one of the fascinating things in history is that the three major religions had very different attitudes towards interest. So the Christian religion, you had prohibitions about interest in the Old Testament, but you had the classic, Jesus in the money in the temple saying, "Give to Caesar what is Caesar's, give to God's what is God's." Basically saying, if you want to charge interest, you can.
Well, let me give you a quote on. Let me give you Exodus,
yes, please.
22:25 from Exodus. "If you lend money to any of my people with you who is poor, you shall not be to him as a creditor, and you shall not exact interest from him." So it's forbidden. According to Exodus.
Forbidden in Exodus. It's forbidden in Deuteronomy, similar part of the Old Testament. But intriguingly, so the Christian religion has a prohibition which is fairly wishy-washy. The Muslim religion, remember that Muhammad was a trader. Okay, he was absolutely anti-interest, and every possible way that you might charge interest on money, he ruled out. You couldn't pay interest in terms of animals. You couldn't pay interest in terms of crops. Whatever you lent, you could whatever you lent, you could get back, but you could get no more. So it was a complete prohibition of charging interest in the Muslim religion, and that's why they talk about Islamic finance and halal loans and so on. They're not supposed to have interest. Now they do make money out of it.
But the approach is supposedly to take an equity position, isn't it?
That's right, equity position rather than a loan that necessarily gets paid.
So
but the exception,
the loan for a house is you take ownership of the house, and then bit by bit the person who you're effectively giving the loan to buys that bit of the house back. Ultimately, it's a bit like a housing community association type approach.
That sort of thing, but the Jewish religion and Deuteronomy and Exodus forbade charging interest to fellow Jews, but said it was okay to Gentiles. And my feeling is this is why, one reason why Jewish people were used as a front in many ways, as well as being initiators themselves, a front for money lending. And then you get this association between the Jewish religion and money lending and this Shylock attitude and so on and so forth. And this is all tied up in the original religion's attitudes to interest, which is compound growth in debt at a time that there wasn't compound growth in the economy because we hadn't tapped these enormous resources of fossil fuels that enables us to have the last quarter millennium of compound physical growth as well as compound growth in debt.
Well, let's pick up on that, because this idea of exponential growth is very much the way we are today, isn't it? And is that right, or are there limits to growth? To go back to the 1970s, we'll look at all of that when we come back in just a second on the Debunking Economics podcast. So we are looking at compound interest. Is it a good thing or a bad thing? Well, it's a fantastic thing, isn't it? If you've got loads of money and you invest it, and then the money you've invested creates money, and then you get interest off that extra money that you've created, and so it goes on until you get this exponential growth, which is the concern of Antonio Turrell, who says basically compound interest does mean exponential growth. And Steve's point before the break was that is not a good thing when you've got finite resources. I want to talk about that in just a second. But we were also talking about religion and quotes about how just borrowing and earning interest was forbidden by most religions, and we seem to have forgotten that.
Yeah, it was forbidden by the Christian religion, but fairly wishy-washy way. Forbidden by the Muslim religion, absolutely didactic way. I've read the Quran on interest in every last possible way you might be able to squeeze out and say you can get interest. The Quran rules it out. But the fascinating one is Deuteronomy, and this is the final chapter in Deuteronomy. Thou shalt not lend upon usury to thy brother. Usury of money, usury of victuals, usury of anything that is lent upon usury. Number 20, unto a stranger thou mayest lend upon usury, but unto thy brother thou shalt not lend upon usury, that the Lord thy God might bless thee in all them, and thou settlest thine in the hand of the land, yada, yada, yada. But basically it's saying don't lend to fellow Jews at interest, but you can lend to Gentiles on interest. And therefore, when you look at medieval society, 1,500 years after this was written, then in medieval society, that's why Jewish people could set up business as a moneylender. Whether they were doing it directly, they were doing it as a front for a Protestant or a Catholic. But the Protestants and Catholics were effectively told they couldn't lend, and the Muslims definitely couldn't lend. So I think this sets up the whole moneylender situation we see for both history of Jewish businesses, but also the attitude that's held towards Jewish people that comes back from this differential attitude to usury for the different religions.
So lending is one side. I'm a bit more interested in this idea of accumulated wealth, because I think that's the real thing. On the lending side, it's awful when you have like payday loans where people are just getting themselves deeper into debt, so that so you are getting the compound effect there. But as we said earlier, for a lot of people, if you make a loan, if you're using that investment to try and grow a business, then that is not compound interest. You're just borrowing, you're paying it off. But this idea that I invest in shares or whatever, and I get a portfolio that keeps on growing and growing and growing, so I'm making more and more money. Of course, I'm making more and more money. Someone's got to be losing out as a result of that, haven't they?
All the systems growing sustainably with your extra financial claims on it, and this, in that sense, what's essential for the change in mentality that's occurred since the 1750s is that before the 1750s, it was seen as completely inappropriate to charge interest at all because there wasn't the physical growth going on at the same time. And that, in that sense, the societies absorbed the physical reality of their worlds, that there was no dramatic increase in income over time, and therefore interest was either frowned upon or was regarded as something at zero, or you do it to somebody who's not in your community. So it was an anti-interest attitude, an anti-usury attitude up to about the 1700s. Then once capitalism takes off, and fundamentally we've got physical growth going on because we're harnessing energy, and over time we find more and more ways of converting energy into useful work for ourselves. So the machinery back in Smith's day, high tech was a railway line, which might burn 100 tons of coal a day. And then now we're modern rockets. We've got Elon Musk's burning equivalently millions of tons per day, in terms of a comparison of the amount of energy consumed by spaceships versus energy consumed by railroads. So accepting interest is a natural part of society. One of the corollaries of that is you've got to have a society where the actual physical output is growing over time as well.
Yeah. Well, I guess, yeah. I mean, another way of looking at it, if I'm getting paid for the money I've invested and I'm getting a return, then that return must have something sitting beneath it. There has to be
It must have some
growth.
physical foundation to it, yeah.
Yeah, something has grown to pay that money, because I wouldn't be getting that payment in dividends or share price growth if the business that was sitting behind it was failing. So the business must be growing. So if I'm getting exponential growth from my investment, then we must be seeing, which I think is Antonio Turril's point, we must be seeing exponential growth in the economy, and we start to accept that that's the normal way of things. And yet, how can it be on a planet with finite resources? And yet, on the other side, we are seeing almost exponential growth in computing, in processing power, for example, so we can do more with less energy. We are increasing the amount of energy we consume, but then chips come along which will use less energy, but we're still getting that growth. So we can go some of the way, but we still need energy. We still need that, that resource that we've been tapping for a long time, as you say.
Yeah, so the fact that the financial sector can charge interest on debt necessarily requires that the physical system is using more energy to create income over time. And the two go together. And I said you can see it in literature, and you can see it in people's attitudes. Usury was a crime. Usury is a sin. Before the 1750s, it's now become the essential part of business. But it wasn't just that we were lending money. We're also living in a world in which we're exploiting fossil fuels and getting more energy per head over time. And on that front, the energy per head that we consume, roughly speaking, from 1750 has grown at a bit more than 2.3% per annum. Now, 2.3% per annum means the energy consumed per century grows by a factor of 10. So in 1725, let's say, were consuming 1 unit of energy. Then in 1825, it's 10 units of energy. In 1925, it's 100 units of energy, and in 2025, it's 1,000 units of energy. So the fact that interest has been feasible to charge also goes in hand with exponential growth in energy consumption. And that does have a limit, because last time I checked, the size of the Earth hadn't grown in the last 4 billion years. The physical side and the physical biosphere we're on, that's the constraint. And that's the one which we've ignored until now, and now we're bumping up against that constraint. So can we maintain exponential growth in the indefinite future? If you ask a mainstream economist, the answer is yes. Therefore, the answer is no, because they're a bunch of fools.
So you've toned your language down on that. Thank you very much, Will.
You're welcome. I won't say F again for at least another 30 minutes.
You don't have to edit quite so much to get on YouTube. Thank God for that. So, I wonder whether there's a bit of attitude in all of this as well. So the idea that if you're wealthy, you love the idea that I'm wealthy and therefore I can get even wealthier by the fact that I'm wealthy. And the wealthier I get, the wealthier I can become, and it just becomes this constant growth. So you earn vulgar amounts of money, and then you discover that you can use that vulgar amount of money to basically take over the world if you're Elon Musk. But if we didn't have that approach, if the system was structured in a way where this exponentiality didn't happen, would you be quite so greedy? Would you actually go, well, okay, and would we, as a in terms of chewing up resources, would we be less greedy as well if we had a simpler system which somehow didn't have this allowance for exponential growth through compound interest? Would we find people's attitude towards growth changes?
I think we would, because again, we can just reverse engineer and look backwards in time and say what was the attitude to growth, in 1200 AD. And the attitude to growth in 1200 AD was it doesn't happen. You are sustaining the level of life you have at the time. Of course, the distribution of income matters massively at that time. So you've got socially structured systems, serfs at the bottom consuming very little, but enough to be able to stay alive and reproduce. The kings and lords at the top consuming a lot more, but nobody expecting that the next king would have much more wealth than the previous king unless they went and conquered territories. So you might even regard a large amount of the wars that occurred before Trump, the wars in the feudal period and slave period. The only way you could expand the amount of wealth that the king got to consume is by taking over more territory. So in some ways, compound interest ended us doing invasions of each other. Well, didn't until America got into the act. But now you've got, in the past, to expand your wealth, you can only do it by expanding your territory. Now you can expand your wealth by expanding the amount of energy you consume, and therefore it's become natural to think of charging a large rate of interest. Charging interest on borrowed money is taken as quite acceptable. But in the pre-industrial period, it wasn't regarded as acceptable unless you shared in the risk of the business. And the type of loans you get for business loans would be for merchants who can travel to some remote part of the world and come back with something that is not made or it doesn't exist in your part of the world. So frankincense and myrrh and all these things we read about in the Bible, gold, amethyst, all these substances, there was immense profit in getting them somewhere where there's abundant and cheap, and you then transfer them somewhere where they're extremely rare, and therefore you can charge a large price on it. And then in that situation, the merchants needed money to borrow money to equip the ships and so on. So charging them interest or taking an equity position in their venture was regarded as a natural part of the commercial role of traders. But people in feudal manses and in established cities and so on, they didn't see growth from one decade to the next. They didn't think you should charge interest on money. And the expectation of permanent improvement in living standards has really only become ingrained since the 1750s.
So how would we get rid of compound interest?
I think one way is to recognise, as I've mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, that banks are getting a far higher rate of return than they deserve to get, because we think about bank lending as if it's lending by an individual, where for an individual to lend, you have to have you lose access to your money. So to compensate for not having access to your own money, you charge interest on it. And therefore, to make it worth your while, you want to charge a large rate of interest to make it attractive to you to do without a amount of principal now to get an income cash flow over time. So we accept rates of interest like 5 and 10%, even 20% on credit cards, because we're thinking, without being aware of it, in terms of one individual lending to another individual, and therefore having to forego spending power. Now, banks don't forego spending power, they create spending power. So to some extent, the return that banks get is based on a fallacious model of what banks actually do. And if we did look at what banks really do, which is create the money rather than lending out money they've already got or lending out their depositors' money, then we'd want a damn sight lower rate of interest than we currently accept.
Yeah, but you know what that does? You know what that does to house prices? I mean, it's, you
can't have house prices falling. I know that's against the religion.
Yeah.
But Jesus did say that the house prices will ultimately take you to heaven.
Yeah, but if you lower interest rates, then people...
You'll never make it to heaven. You'll be stuck in purgatory. So obviously we've got to have high rates of interest, and therefore house prices can rise forever. Yeah.
Well, yeah, but if you lower interest rates, then people will borrow more, and that's going to push house prices up.
Well, that again says, what do you allow this to happen for? So we've allowed borrowed money to be used to drive up prices of assets rather than to create the physical assets in the first instance.
Rather than go out searching for gold and frankincense and myrrh like the olden days. There are...
Or bring a meteor back to the planet, as modern capitalists are talking about. But yeah, there is a definite dependence between the rate of interest and the rate of energy consumption and growth over time, and that interest might not have a limit, but the planet does. So I think we're in the final decades of being able to think in terms of high rates of interest and high rates of growth on this biosphere.
So I guess the counter argument, if you say, well, this compound growth that you're seeing from money that you've invested or money that you've saved, interesting terms, but anyway, let's just call it money that you've saved, that you've put onto your super fund or into your pension fund, for example,
Yeah.
which has compounded over the years through your life, so that you have a decent standard of living at the end. Without that compound growth, we would have very poor pensioners.
Well, our pensioners, I mean, we are far wealthier in energy terms than our predecessors. We're not conscious of it because we've never had a conversation with our predecessors. Imagine what would be the reaction of your great-great-grandfather and great-great-grandmother if you could bring them back to life and see them inside the house you live inside, and you hop and say, "Excuse me, I've got to go have a shower." What's a shower? Okay. Oh, you can't. It's too cold. It's hot water.
Yeah.
How's it hot? I mean, all these things we take for granted
Yeah.
are products of the last century, where we've just dramatically increased the amount of energy we mine out of the surface of the planet, the fossil fuels fundamentally, and we're enjoying that massive energy increase without even being conscious how exceptional that is in historical terms. So quite arguably, an average middle-class person in America now is consuming probably a higher level of energy than a king from 300 years ago. But you look at the Elon Musk, compare yourself to Elon Musk, you're not consuming anything relative to the wealthiest now, but relative to the wealthiest before we started exploiting the energy, we're consuming an enormous amount.
But is there an easy system, just to finish off with, if we say that compound interest is a problem because of its exponentiality? What is the, other than charging lower interest rates or paying lower interest rates, you'd still get that exponential impact. But if the interest rates are lower, then obviously the effect of it is going to be shallower. But is there a way that you can just say, well, actually, the idea of compound interest could be abolished altogether? So if you invest $100,000 and you get a return on that, the return that you're getting won't see the ability for you to invest for subsequent interest. I mean, how do you get rid of that? It's a complicated thing to implement, isn't it?
It is. But again, what we take for granted now just depends upon a massive growth in our energy consumption over time. If that becomes impossible in the future, then so does interest. And to me, one of the crunches that's going to come from global warming is that at some point we're going to get catastrophes that make the Strait of Hormuz look like a really good plan, and the economy is going to plunge, and people who've borrowed money and expected to be able to pay interest out of the growth of their business over time are going to find their business shrinking. They therefore can't pay their debts. So the banking system will be unable to be repaid and will have massive bankruptcies coming out of that. So I don't expect a major financial crisis from the dynamics of credit itself this time round. But I do expect a major crisis out of the dynamics of energy consumption and the damage we're doing to the biosphere. And at some point we realise we simply can't continue down this path. So the rate of growth of energy per head will cease, so long as we're restricted to this biosphere. And that'll be the end of compound interest as well.
Right. Or interest at all, in fact, on that base. Because why?
Yeah.
Because you're not going to see the returns. If you're not seeing the returns, then no one's going to borrow any money. You're just going to...
Yeah, and then I think in
the old way that we were all brought up from our parents or grandparents was you spent the money you had.
Yeah, and that'll be... I mean, if we survive what climate change is going to do to our societies, and I think it's an if rather than when, than a given, then, and if we don't take production off the biosphere, then we've got to reduce the amount of energy we take out of the biosphere, reduce the amount of waste we dump into it to have anything that's sustainable on this biosphere. And that means that's the end of compound growth, not just of interest, but of the economy as well.
So just about how things have moved on, just as a finishing point, an anecdote, and you might not relate to this because I think Australia perhaps was a little bit more advanced than the UK when we were young. But to get we did have hot water in our house. But to get the hot water, you had to light the fire because the boiler was basically heated up by the coal fire. So you lit the coal fire in the morning so that the water would boil and then that would go through the pipes, and that's how you got hot water. That sounds so basic these days, doesn't it?
It does, because we're just used to turning on a tap and out comes hot water. We're not conscious of the fact that that relies upon a massive amount of energy that we take for granted, which our ancestors did not have.
Yeah, at least you could
We're
see
about to rejoin our ancestors.
Yeah, at least you could see the coal burning, so you knew the cost and how much energy was being consumed in it all. Yeah.
These
even
days, you flick a switch, it's become invisible to us.
Yeah. We have a lot to learn. Absolutely. All right, very good. We'll catch you again next week. Thanks, Steve.
Thank you, mate.